Reid arrives at the desolate ancestral home, a sprawling Gothic structure shrouded in the valley's perpetual mist. He's filled with a mix of academic curiosity and a hopeful, if naive, sense of new beginnings. He dismisses the initial creaks, cold spots, and faint whispers as the quirks of an old house. The last paved road gave way to gravel, then to a track barely wider than his vehicle. Reid gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale against the worn leather. The silence of the remote landscape had been absolute for miles, broken only by the crunch of tires and the low hum of the engine. He had left the city's ceaseless thrum behind, a cacophony of ambition and disappointment that had grown too loud to ignore. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world, he sought not merely quiet, but clarity. A fresh start. A place where the threads of forgotten folklore might finally weave into the narrative he so desperately wanted to write. His inherited home lay nestled in a valley known only through obscure regional maps and the hushed accounts of a few remaining locals. Its reputation was less a matter of geographical significance and more one of persistent, unsettling rumor. As an amateur folklorist, this was precisely the kind of forgotten corner Reid gravitated towards. He was determined, a man whose intellectual curiosity often masked a deeper, more personal yearning for purpose. The track descended sharply, the air growing noticeably cooler, heavier. A thick gray mist, not quite fog, clung to the ancient pines that lined the path, their needles dripping with unseen moisture. The world narrowed, enclosed by the encroaching forest. Then, a break in the trees revealed a dilapidated structure. A wooden barrier, half-rotted and draped with moss, sagged across the track. This was the border checkpoint, a forgotten marker of a place that time had chosen to bypass. No guard booth, no attendant, just a stark, weathered sign, its faded letters illegible. Reid maneuvered his vehicle around it, the tires kicking up wet earth. The sensation was not unlike passing into a different temporal zone, a place where the rules of the outside world held less sway. The valley itself was a vast, sunken bowl, the mist a perpetual shroud that softened the edges of the distant peaks and swallowed the midday sun. It lent everything a muted, monochrome cast. The air tasted of damp earth and decaying leaves, a primal scent that seeped into the vehicle's cabin. He drove for another 10 minutes, the road becoming little more than 2 faint ruts in the overgrown grass, before the house materialized through the swirling vapor. The sheer scale of it was arresting. This was not merely an old house. It was a testament to a forgotten lineage, a repository of silent history. He recognized it as a familiar thrill, the academic's excitement at a rich, untouched subject. He parked the vehicle on the overgrown drive, the crunch of gravel beneath the tires unnaturally loud in the profound stillness. The mist swirled, parting briefly to reveal the house's imposing facade, then closing in again, obscuring the upper floors. He inhaled deeply, the air sharp and clean, carrying the faint metallic tang of something ancient and deep within the earth. The front door, heavy oak bound with rusted iron, groaned in protest as he pushed it open. A gust of frigid air met him, carrying the scent of dust, mildew, and something else. A faint, almost imperceptible sweetness, like dried flowers or forgotten spices. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the grimy leaded windows. He ran a hand along a peeling wall, the plaster cool and crumbly beneath his fingertips. The house was a derelict monument, a skeletal outline of grandeur. A floorboard creaked somewhere above him, a long, drawn-out groan that seemed to settle into the very fabric of the house. He paused, listening. The sound did not repeat. Just the house settling, he thought, the rational part of his mind already categorizing and dismissing. Old houses made noise. It was a simple fact of their existence. He walked deeper, his gaze sweeping over cobweb-draped chandeliers and shrouded furniture. He attributed it to drafts, perhaps a broken pane, or the sheer age of the structure. Reid's academic training offered a ready explanation for everything. The creaks were structural stresses. He was a man of logic, a scholar of the tangible and the historically recorded, even if his chosen field often skirted the edges of the inexplicable. He had come here for a fresh perspective, for the raw material of myth, not to be swayed by the easily dismissed. He had hoped for inspiration, for a quiet place to rebuild his life, not for phantoms. He was determined to see it that way. Dust lay thick on every surface, a fine gray blanket. Reid stopped, head cocked. He heard nothing more. The house was speaking, yes, but in the language of decay, of wood and stone surrendering to time. He was certain of it. For now, he was. The vastness of the ancestral library was less a comfort and more a pronouncement of neglect. Dust motes, thick as pollen, danced in the few shafts of weak light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating shelves that stretched to the vaulted ceiling. The air was still, heavy with the scent of decaying paper, stagnant air, and something else. A faint, almost metallic tang, like old blood or forgotten iron. Reid ran a hand over a leather-bound spine, the fine powder adhering to his fingertips. He felt a peculiar mix of academic excitement and a profound sense of isolation. This was it, the core of the house's buried history. He began systematically, pulling down volumes, his movements slow and deliberate, each book a small puff of ancient dust. Most were expected: arcane legal texts, volumes of forgotten poetry, and dense agricultural treatises concerning crops that no longer grew in the valley. But soon, anomalies began to surface. Tucked between a worn atlas and a collection of sermons, he found a thin, unbound sheaf of papers, brittle and yellowed. The handwriting was erratic, almost frantic, dated from the late 18th century. It spoke of the creeping quiet and the whisper that steals names. Reid felt a prickle of unease that had nothing to do with the chill in the room. He continued, his focus narrowing. Deeper into the recesses of a particularly dim alcove, where the light faded to a perpetual twilight, he discovered a collection of hand-stitched journals. Their covers were rough, made of what felt like cured hide, and their pages were filled with scrawled entries, some barely legible. Unlike the formal scripts of the other books, these entries were personal, raw, and increasingly nonsensical. They spoke in fragmented sentences, shifting perspectives, and referred to events and places Reid had never heard of, even in the local histories he'd briefly perused. One journal, bound in dark, cracked leather, fell open to a page dated over a century ago. It takes the edges first, the forgotten names, the faded photographs. He wasn't just reading history. He was touching something alive, something that resonated with the very air in the room. He pulled another, larger volume from the shelf, an almanac for the valley, published intermittently over 2 centuries. Its pages were filled with agricultural advice, local news, and increasingly cryptic warnings. One entry, nestled between crop rotations and weather predictions for a year long past, mentioned the disappearance of a specific geological marker, a prominent crag that had, according to older maps, once stood at what locals had called the border checkpoint to the valley. This was something deeper, more insidious. The journals and almanacs spoke of a gradual erasure, a quiet consumption. He wasn't merely an observer of these old records. He felt as though he was a participant, an unwitting inheritor of the very things they described. Nothing. Only the dust and the ancient wood. Yet the feeling persisted, sharpened, evolving into something more intrusive. It began subtly, a fleeting sense that his thoughts were not entirely his own. A phrase he considered, a question forming in his mind, felt momentarily echoed, as if a faint, unseen ripple accompanied his internal monologue. He dismissed it as fatigue, as the overactive imagination of a folklorist steeped in unsettling texts. But the sensation returned, stronger each time. He would formulate a theory about the journals, a tentative connection between two disparate entries, and for a split second, it felt as though the thought was not just his, but also observed. Not by another person, but by something formless, something that resided in the heavy air itself. The fading truths, the quiet hunger. Was this what they referred to? Not just the disappearance of physical markers or collective memories, but the erosion of individual perception, the subtle siphoning of the very process of thought? Reid closed his eyes, pressing his palms against his temples. He was tired, yes, but this was different. This was an interior violation. He was alone, undeniably. But the feeling of being intimately, insidiously listened to had solidified. It was no longer a vague apprehension. The house, or whatever resided within it, was not merely watching him. It was delving into the very architecture of his consciousness. The scent of aged paper and dormant dust clung to Reid's clothes, a constant companion in the decaying study. He had risen from his desk, a specific thought propelling him towards the kitchen, a faint, insistent whisper of needing something. Now, standing amidst the chipped enamel and the silent hum of the old refrigerator, the purpose had evaporated. His gaze drifted over the worn linoleum, the streaked window pane, the forgotten teacup on the counter. The reason, a fleeting, tangible thing just moments ago, was simply gone. He pressed his thumb and forefinger against his temples, a dull ache beginning to throb behind his eyes. It must be the strain, he reasoned, the sheer volume of his research, the endless days poring over the faded script of his ancestors. He returned to the study, the unanswered question lingering like an echo. Yet, the sheaf of notes he had meticulously compiled from it, detailing a specific local deity, was absent. He scoured the desk, his fingers sweeping over stacks of journals, old maps, and loose parchment. Frustration coiled in his gut. He had a system, rudimentary perhaps, but functional. These notes were essential, the linchpin for his next chapter. He remembered placing them beneath the heavy iron paperweight. He searched again, more methodically this time, pulling books from shelves, checking beneath the desk's clawed feet. Nothing. He exhaled slowly, trying to calm the sudden tremor in his hands. It was the house, he decided, its inherent disarray, the way the shadows played tricks, the sheer volume of his accumulated research. He was simply absent-minded, overly focused. He found the notes, eventually, tucked inside a copy of Virgil, a book he hadn't touched in days, its spine cracked, its pages brittle. He stared at them, a small, irrational shiver running through him. He would never have put them there. His rationalizations, however, were becoming less convincing, their edges frayed. The incidents began to escalate, their frequency increasing with an unsettling regularity. He'd attempt to recall a specific detail from his journey to the valley, a mundane but recent event, like the interaction at the border checkpoint. He could picture the small, weather-beaten hut, the dull gleam of the uniformed officer's badge, the low thrum of the idling engine of his own vehicle. But the officer's face, the precise questions asked, the exact words he had spoken in return. These details were smudged, indistinct, like old photographs left too long in the sun. He struggled to recall the name on the officer's lapel, or even the general tone of their conversation. Was the officer pleasant? Curt? He could not say. Now, attempting to reconstruct the conversation, he found gaping holes. What had he specifically told his colleague about the ancestral home? Had he mentioned the valley's unsettling myths? He could summon the general feeling of the call, the distant hum of the city in the background, but the words themselves were like smoke, dissipating the moment he tried to grasp them. His memory felt like a sieve, letting crucial information drain away. One afternoon, he found himself staring at his reflection in the tarnished mirror of the hall, a stranger looking back. He knew his own name, Reid. He knew his age, roughly. But a specific memory, a vivid childhood image, a first crush, the details of his parents' faces. They felt distant, like stories read in a book rather than lived experiences. He could recall the idea of them, the conceptual framework, but the sensory richness, the specific defining nuances, were dull, muted, almost entirely absent. It was as if a thin, translucent film had been placed over his past, blurring its sharp edges. This was beyond absent-mindedness. This was a systematic erosion. The house seemed to breathe around him, its old timbers groaning, the wind whistling a low, mournful tune through the eaves. He was losing himself, piece by agonizing piece, and the rationalizations, once comforting shields, now felt like flimsy excuses against an invisible, pervasive enemy. The chipped enamel of the kitchen sink gleamed dully under the single bare bulb. Reid stood, a specific, unnamed need still a phantom on the edge of his awareness. A ceramic mug, half filled with cold tea from the morning, sat on the counter. He was certain he had placed it by the window. Now it rested precisely in the center of the wooden cutting board. His brow furrowed. He picked it up, the ceramic cool against his palm, and set it back by the window. Perhaps he was more distracted than he realized. The house, after all, demanded a certain mental bandwidth. He moved to the small pantry, its door ajar, revealing shelves lined with tins and jars. A box of saltines, which he distinctly remembered placing on the top shelf, now occupied a lower one, partially obscuring a jar of pickled onions. Reid paused, his hand hovering. This was not his doing. It was too small to be deliberate mischief, too mundane to be a threat, yet it felt intrusive. Later that afternoon, as he transcribed notes in the study, a faint, reedy melody drifted from the upper floor. It was not a familiar tune, nor was it the sound of the house groaning. It was a precise, almost delicate arrangement of notes, like a music box played at a distance. Yet it carried an unsettling, mournful quality. Reid pushed his chair back, the scrape loud in the sudden silence of the house. He listened, straining his ears. He ascended the main staircase, each step creaking beneath his weight, the sound a counterpoint to the distant, ethereal melody. He reached the landing, the music now clearer, though still impossibly soft, seeming to emanate from behind the closed door of the master suite. He pushed the door inward. The room was empty. A four-poster bed, stripped bare, dominated the center. No music box, no hidden speaker, no source. The melody, however, persisted, now seeming to come from the very air itself, encompassing him, pressing in. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it ceased. He felt watched, not by a person, but by the space itself. The house, he realized, was not merely old, it was attentive. The following days brought a deepening of the strangeness. Not the natural sway of branches outside, but impossible shifts within the corners of his vision. In the hallway mirror, a quick, distorted image of himself. His features stretched, his eyes too wide, dissolving before he could properly focus. Or was it not him? He would blink, and his own tired, ordinary face would stare back. He began to check his own appearance with an unsettling frequency, running a hand over his jaw, touching his eyes, confirming his own tangible presence. One evening, while preparing a meager dinner, a specific memory surfaced. He recalled the border checkpoint he had passed through on his way into the valley. A stark, functional structure manned by a lone board official. The memory was clear, precise. But then, an intrusive detail, sharp and unsettling. The official's face, in his memory, was suddenly indistinct, a blurred canvas. The distortion was subtle, yet pervasive, like a ripple in a still pond, spreading outwards from the core of the memory. He shook his head, pushing the thought away. The house, he knew, was trying to make him doubt his past, his very journey here. He needed to document these occurrences, to anchor himself in objective reality, even as that reality seemed to fray. He opened his journal, his pen poised. And Reid, determined to understand, felt a terrifying growing certainty that the entity was not just in the house, but was the house itself, slowly, deliberately, consuming him from the inside out. The cold tea in the ceramic mug offered no comfort, its aroma a faint, forgotten whisper. Reid stood in the kitchen, a residue of irritation still clinging to him, but beneath it, a new sensation began to solidify. It was not the familiar disorientation, nor the creeping forgetfulness, but a distinct, cold dread, sharp and insistent. The house, usually a silent observer, seemed to hum with an expectant tension. His destination became clear. The small, rarely used study at the far end of the second-floor landing, a room crammed with forgotten ledgers and faded maps. Reid's gaze, guided by an instinct he couldn't explain, fell upon an old mahogany desk, its surface scarred by generations of use. He ran his hand along the ornate carvings, a subtle tremor running through him. There was a faint incongruity, a slight give in the wood near the back left corner. He pressed, probed, his fingers tracing the outline of a barely visible seam. With a soft click, a narrow panel slid inward, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed velvet, was a stack of letters, bound with brittle, faded ribbon. Their paper was thick, handmade, the ink a testament to time's relentless erosion. Reid's fingers trembled as he untied the ribbon, the paper rustling like dry leaves. He noted the varied handwriting, the different dates spanning nearly 2 centuries. The first letter, dated 1837, was penned in a delicate looping script. The next letter, from 1912, was written in a more forceful, masculine hand. It detailed a great-uncle, Arthur, who had become obsessed with escaping the valley's grip. Arthur had attempted to flee, his words desperate. "I must leave this place, for it steals not my life, my very self." The letter described his journey, his growing paranoia. I could not pass. It was as if the world beyond the barrier had no room for someone already half erased. "Arthur," the letter lamented. The image of the border checkpoint, the official's blank stare, resonated with a profound, terrifying clarity. It wasn't just the house. It was a deeper, more pervasive threat. A third letter, dated 1958, was typewritten, the words stark and precise. I find myself forgetting simple things, faces, names, the taste of my favorite tea. It's as if my mind is a sieve, and something is sifting away the grains of who I am. My memories feel borrowed, thin, like photographs bleached by too much sun. The family history is replete with these disappearances, these fading away. We are not mad. We are being erased. Clara, the letter ended abruptly, had gone to rest and was never seen again. Reid sat back, the brittle papers scattering around him. The air in the study grew heavy, pressing in on him. This wasn't a haunting. It was a lineage, a pattern etched in the very bloodline of his family. His own experiences, the blank spaces, the forgotten purposes, the encroaching sense of unreality, were not unique. They were merely the latest manifestations of a historical curse, now firmly fastened to him. The house, far from offering a fresh start, was merely the latest stage for an ancient, insidious predator, and he, Reid, was its newest meal. Reid held the brittle, yellowed paper in his hands, the last letter from his grandmother. The word itself, grandmother, felt heavy, a foreign object in his mind. He knew it was a descriptor, a relationship, but the specific woman, the face, the sound of her voice, they were dissolving, like ink in water. He stood in what he believed was the library, though the scent of old paper and dust felt less like familiar comfort and more like an unfamiliar shroud. The room itself seemed to breathe around him, the bookshelves appearing taller, the ceiling beams pressing down with a subtle, shifting weight. He looked at his own hand, then at the letter. What was his name? A cold, hollow space opened in his chest. He knew it began with an R, perhaps. Reid? The sound felt both right and utterly alien, a label someone else might have given him. Reid. It was a question, not an affirmation. Why was he here? This house. He was here for a book about local myths. He was a folklorist. Or was he? The purpose, once so clear, now shimmered at the edge of his perception. A half-remembered dream. The ornate fireplace, which he distinctly remembered being on the south wall, now stood squarely on the east, its sooty bricks a stark, impossible presence. He stumbled back, his hand reaching for the solid oak desk he usually worked at, but his fingers met only rough, unyielding plaster. The desk was gone. A low hum began to vibrate through the floorboards, a resonant thrum that seemed to originate from the very foundations of the house. It was not a sound of machinery or wind, but something deeper, organic, like the sustained note of a colossal, unseen instrument. Reid's breath hitched. He pushed through the archway, compelled by a desperate need to find something familiar, something that could anchor him. The corridor stretched before him, impossibly long, the wallpaper patterns repeating into a dizzying tunnel. The floral motifs, once a faded rose and cream, now pulsed with a sickly green and bruised purple, the petals seeming to unfurl and retract in his peripheral vision. Each step he took seemed to lengthen the passage, the distant end receding as he advanced. He remembered a border checkpoint, a concrete barrier, a uniformed official whose face was a blank slate. The memory flared, sharp and distinct, then dissolved into a confused haze. What was its significance? Had he been there recently? Or was it a dream? The official had stared at him, a profound, unsettling gaze that suggested he knew something Reid did not. Now the image was just a broken shard of glass, reflecting nothing coherent. Panic began to claw at his throat. A swing set in a backyard, the taste of a specific cookie, the warmth of a hand holding his. All were gone, replaced by a vast, echoing emptiness. It was as if his past had been meticulously erased, leaving only the present moment, adrift and without context. He knew this door. It led to the kitchen, a space he had spent hours in, making tea, attempting to cook. There was no stove, no sink, no table. Reid backed away, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The house was not merely shifting. It was actively consuming his reality, mirroring the erosion within his own mind. But the face, it was his, yet subtly wrong. The lines were deeper, the skin paler, the expression one of profound, uncomprehending loss. He was a stranger in his own reflection, a ghost haunting a decaying memory. He could not stay. The house was a maw, the valley its gullet, and he, the morsel. Determination, sharp and brittle, propelled him from the bed. He would leave. He would drive until the suffocating green gave way to something recognizable, something real. He descended the creaking stairs, the silence of the house pressing against his ears. He grabbed a handful of stale crackers, their dry texture a mild discomfort against his tongue, and a bottle of tepid water. Survival was a mechanical process now, devoid of pleasure or even true sustenance. His focus was singular. Escape. Outside, the morning mist clung to the trees, muffling sound, distorting distance. His car, a battered sedan, sat beneath a weeping willow, its paint dulled by the pervasive damp. He inserted the key, the action deliberate, a small ritual of defiance. He turned it. The engine groaned, a thin, reedy whine, followed by a series of desultory clicks. He tried again. The same pathetic complaint, weaker this time. He tried the lights, the radio. Nothing. The battery was dead, completely, utterly drained. He slammed his palm against the steering wheel, the impact rattling the dashboard. This was not a coincidence. He pulled his phone from his pocket. No signal. He tried the landline inside the house. A dead line. There was only one option left. Walk. He would follow the main track, the same one he'd driven in on until he reached the valley's mouth. It had to lead somewhere. He packed a small bag with water, the remaining crackers, and a tattered map he'd found in the glove compartment. The map, he noted, ended abruptly at the valley's edge, a blank space where the outside world should have been. A bad omen, perhaps, or merely an old, incomplete printing. He pushed the thought away. The track was overgrown, the gravel path barely visible beneath a layer of fallen leaves and encroaching weeds. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of unease through him. The trees seemed taller here, their branches weaving a canopy that filtered the sunlight into sickly green shafts. He walked for what felt like hours, his legs aching, his breath growing ragged. The path, though ostensibly straight, seemed to curve back on itself, the landmarks he thought he recognized appearing again and again, subtly altered. A gnarled oak, a split boulder. They were familiar, yet never quite in the right place, never quite where they should have been. The valley was playing a trick on him, stretching itself, twisting its own geometry. Just as a creeping despair began to settle in, a low, squat building emerged from the mist ahead. It was a dilapidated structure, barely more than a shack, with a faded sign that read, "Valley's End Provisions." Beyond it, half obscured by dense scrub, stood a rusted metal barrier, the gate of a forgotten border checkpoint. The sight sparked a flicker of hope, however dim. Someone might be there. Someone might know a way out. He pushed open the sagging door of the shop. A bell, surprisingly clear, jingled above him. The interior was dim, smelling of dust, dried herbs, and something vaguely metallic, like old coins. Shelves lined with ancient, unlabeled tins and jars stood sentinel in the gloom. Behind a counter, hunched over a worn wooden surface, sat an old man. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a watery blue, fixed on a ledger he held in his trembling hands. "Can I help you, stranger?" The shopkeeper's voice was a rasp, like dry leaves skittering across stone. He did not look up. "My car broke down," Reid began, his voice hoarse from exertion and anxiety. "The phone lines are dead. I need to get out of the valley. Is there another way?" The old man slowly lifted his head, his gaze finally meeting Reid's. There was an unnerving stillness in his eyes, a depth that seemed to hold centuries of quiet observation. "No other way. Not once the valley has its claim." He spoke slowly, deliberately. "My car just died. It's an old vehicle." The shopkeeper chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "The valley takes what it wants, young man. Always has, always will." He tapped a skeletal finger against the ledger. "It takes your time, your direction, your way out. But most of all," he paused, his eyes narrowing, "it takes your memories. The price of staying here, you see, is the price of memory." Reid's breath caught in his throat. The price of memory. The words echoed the erosion he'd experienced, the dissolving face of his grandmother. "What are you talking about? I saw the border checkpoint just outside." The shopkeeper finally looked towards the window, his gaze distant. "That old gate? Been closed for 50 years. No one comes in, no one goes out. Not without the valley say so. And it rarely says so." He turned back to Reid, a faint, unsettling smile playing on his lips. "You've forgotten too much already, haven't you? The faces, the names, the reasons you came here. It started its feast, son." The man offered no solution, no map, no hidden path. The valley wasn't just isolated, it was a trap. And the entity, the thing that fed on memory, was not confined to the house. It was the valley itself, vast and inescapable, its hunger insatiable. The border checkpoint was not a gateway, but a monument to his entrapment. Reid drove, the old truck's engine a strained growl against the unnatural quiet of the valley. The encounter with the man at the derelict structure had stripped away any lingering hope of a benign explanation. The valley was a trap, the entity an inescapable predator. Escape, he reasoned, was the only remaining imperative. He followed the winding, overgrown path the man had indicated, a track that narrowed until it was barely more than a scar in the earth, the canopy overhead so dense it seemed perpetually twilight. He eventually reached it, the border checkpoint. It was not a bustling gateway, nor even a disused toll booth. It was an assemblage of concrete barriers, cracked and moss-laden, arranged in a forgotten pattern that suggested control, now long relinquished. A rusted metal gate, half off its hinges, leaned precariously against a sagging fence of barbed wire that disappeared into the dense, silent woods. To one side, a small, squat building stood, its windows boarded over with weathered planks, its paint long since peeled away to reveal the raw, gray concrete beneath. It might once have been an administrative office or perhaps a guard post. Now it was just another decaying monument to abandonment. A chill, unrelated to the encroaching evening, settled over Reid. He cut the engine. The sudden silence pressed in, a physical weight. The only sound was the distant, indistinguishable rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. He approached the building, his boots crunching on gravel and broken glass. The door, a heavy slab of warped wood, hung ajar, revealing a maw of impenetrable gloom. A single, weak shaft of light pierced a crack in the boarded window, illuminating motes dancing in the heavy air. The room was sparse, almost empty. An overturned chair, a scattering of forgotten papers reduced to brittle flakes, and against the far wall, leaning at an impossible angle, stood a mirror. It was ancient, even by the standards of the decaying house Reid had left behind. Its frame was a tarnished, intricate swirl of blackened metal, once perhaps silver or brass, now merely a dull, oxidized husk. The glass itself was clouded, a milky film obscuring its surface. He saw the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. But then, as he stared, the clarity wavered. The milky film seemed to thin, not revealing the glass beneath, but shifting, as if the very surface of the mirror was alive. His features began to distort, subtly at first. It wasn't his face anymore. It was a shifting mosaic, a fleeting kaleidoscope of forgotten visages. An old woman with severe, deep-set eyes, her lips pressed into a thin, unyielding line. A young man with a proud, almost arrogant tilt to his chin, his gaze defiant. He saw his own nose on one face, his grandfather's brow on another, the curve of a stranger's lips on a third. They were not just faces. They were expressions, fragments of souls, each one lingering for a moment before dissolving into the next. Were these his ancestors? The previous inhabitants of the valley? The implication solidified in his mind, sharp and terrible. These weren't just memories being reflected. These were echoes of identity, the distinct patterns of being, the unique imprints of self. The mirror wasn't showing him forgotten faces. It was showing him the remains of what had been consumed. The entity didn't merely steal recollections. It devoured the very architecture of personhood. It assimilated the core essence of its victims, leaving behind only these spectral, discarded masks. He stared, transfixed, as his own reflection returned. But it was subtly wrong. It was like looking at himself through a veil woven from countless forgotten lives. This was his fate. He would become a vessel, a living archive of its consumed history, his own Reidness dissolving into a chorus of the lost. The border checkpoint wasn't a place of escape. It was just another stage in the entity's long, slow process of ingestion. The valley wasn't a trap he could leave. It was merely the stomach of a leviathan, and he was already inside. His hands, when he finally pulled them away from the tarnished frame, felt numb, disconnected. His vision swam. He was not just losing his memories. He was losing himself. And the mirror, ancient and malevolent, had just shown him the proof. The truck's tired engine hummed a continuous strained lament as Reid pushed it towards the valley's northern edge. The winding dirt track, barely wide enough for a single vehicle, was a ribbon of pale dust unspooling through a landscape that seemed to actively resist any passage. The air, heavy and still, tasted of damp earth and something else, a faint, metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. He clutched the steering wheel, knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the dwindling light ahead. Escape. The word was a fragile, desperate prayer. The road eventually widened, the trees receding to reveal a stark, functional structure. The border checkpoint. It was less a gate, more a corrugated iron shed with a single boom barrier, manned by a solitary figure in a drab uniform. The guard, a man whose face was obscured by the shadow of his cap, watched Reid's approach with an unnerving stillness. Reid slowed, the truck groaning to a halt before the barrier. He rolled down the window. The air that rushed in was colder here, carrying the faint, acrid scent of exhaust fumes. Identification. The guard's voice was flat, devoid of inflection. Reid fumbled for his wallet, his fingers clumsy. He presented his driver's license. The guard took it, his gloved hand brushing Reid's. A cold tremor ran through Reid's arm. There was no recognition, no curiosity, just a profound, unsettling emptiness. "Purpose of travel?" the guard asked, his gaze unwavering. "Leaving the valley," Reid stated, the words feeling utterly insufficient. The guard returned the license. "This road leads only to the valley. There is no exit." Reid's breath hitched. "What do you mean? This is the main road out." The guard simply stared, an unblinking presence. His uniform, stiff and ill-fitting, seemed to absorb the light around him. He looked past the guard, past the shed. The road beyond the barrier was not a continuation, but a gradual dissolution into dense, impenetrable forest. Trees too tall, too close, their branches weaving a canopy that swallowed the sky. There was no other side, no path beyond. The border checkpoint was a dead end, a cruel joke. The valley wasn't just a location, it was a containment. The truck idled, its vibrations a faint drumming against his ribs. The guard remained motionless, a silent sentinel of an impossible boundary. Reid felt the entity's presence then, a subtle shift in the air, a pressure behind his eyes, a quiet hum in his inner ear. Escape was not an option. He was not meant to leave. A memory, fragmented and sharp-edged, pierced through the haze of despair. It wasn't about leaving. It was about severing. A countermeasure. A suicidal ritual. The words, half erased in faded ink, flashed behind his eyes. To unbind the thread. The guard watched him, still unmoving, until Reid's vehicle was once more facing the way he had come. Not to surrender, but to fight. The escape he sought was not physical, but existential. The drive back to the house was a blur of growing resolve. He pulled the heavy leather-bound volumes from the shelves, scattering loose parchments across the mahogany desk. He worked with a feverish intensity, his fingers trembling as he sifted through generations of cryptic notes and half-finished genealogies. He focused on the marginalia, the hastily scrawled additions, the passages underlined with desperate emphasis. He ignored the family trees, the mundane records, searching for the strange, the anomalous, the things his ancestors had tried to hide or forget. His eyes burned. There were symbols, roughly sketched, repeating across different documents. a coiled serpent devouring its own tail, a broken circle, an eye weeping black tears. There were references to specific phases of the moon, to ingredients both mundane and grotesque, to a sequence of actions that read less like prayer and more like an incantation of utter defiance. The text spoke of a binding severance, a temporary banishment, and the terrifying phrase, "the cost of consciousness." One passage, written in a hand that was almost illegible, spoke of the ritual's true nature. It wasn't a purification, but a sacrifice. Not of life, but of self. To sever the connection, one had to become unconnectable. To banish the entity, one had to step outside the realm of its influence, which meant stepping outside the realm of ordinary perception. He sat back, the brittle papers surrounding him like fallen leaves. The knowledge was a heavy weight, a leaden cloak around his shoulders. It was not a victory he sought, but a desperate final stand. He would not escape the valley, nor would he escape the entity. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could sever its hold, even if it meant sacrificing the very essence of who he was. The thought was terrifying, yet a grim determination settled deep within him. There was no other way. He had meticulously followed the instructions, arranging the few remaining artifacts: a tarnished silver locket, a shard of dark, polished stone, a dried sprig of an unknown herb, in a precise circle on the floor. The final instruction was not a chant, nor an offering, but a mental act, a severing. To become unconnectable, to sacrifice the very essence of self. He closed his eyes, focusing on the void within, attempting to unravel the threads of his own identity, to become a blank slate, an echo. A low hum began, not from the room, but from within his skull, vibrating against the bone. When he opened his eyes, the study was subtly altered. The floorboards beneath his feet felt less solid, a faint give, like walking on a stretched membrane. It spoke a name, not his own, but one he vaguely recognized from the family tree, a forgotten ancestor. Then another and another, a chorus of spectral names, each one a faint spark of a life extinguished, a memory devoured. The details flickered, insubstantial, like images on a failing projector. The walls of the study began to ripple, the faded wallpaper seeming to breathe. Patterns shifted, forming grotesque visages that melted back into floral designs, only to reform with new, unsettling expressions. He reached out a hand, intending to steady himself against a desk, but his fingers passed through the solid oak, a brief, horrifying moment of non-existence. He snatched his hand back, his breath catching in his throat. The hum intensified, becoming a roar that compressed the air, making his eardrums ache. The room dissolved. One moment he was in the study, the next he stood on a cracked asphalt road, a biting wind whipping at his clothes. Ahead, a drab concrete structure loomed, a barrier stretching across the desolate landscape. A sign, half obscured by grime, read, "Border Checkpoint." He looked down at his hands. They were not his. They were older, gnarled, the skin papery and thin. He felt a profound sense of disorientation, a panic that threatened to consume him. Reid searched his pockets, his mind a frantic scramble. But his fingers encountered only empty cloth. He tried to speak, to explain, but the words caught in his throat, meaningless sounds. Who was he exactly? The question echoed in the vast emptiness behind his eyes. He saw flashes of other lives. A farmer tilling barren soil, a weaver hunched over a loom, a scholar poring over ancient texts. Were these his memories? Or were they the entity's insidious projections, the discarded identities of those it had consumed? The border guard's face remained a blank, impassive slate. You have no papers. You have no designation. Reid felt a profound, aching emptiness where his history should have been. His name, Reid, felt like a borrowed word, an ill-fitting garment. He was dissolving, becoming a phantom of a phantom. He stumbled backward, the asphalt road buckling beneath his feet, the concrete structure of the border checkpoint fracturing into impossible angles. The scene collapsed, folding in on itself like wet paper, and he was back in the study, though it was no longer recognizable. The walls were a swirling vortex of indistinct colors, the ceiling a gaping maw that seemed to inhale the very light. The furniture was gone, replaced by skeletal outlines that pulsed with a faint, sickly luminescence. They pressed in on him, each voice a tiny shard of a broken life, seeking to lodge itself within his own dissolving core. He could feel the entity, no longer a subtle presence, but an overwhelming force, a vast emptiness that sought to fill him, to make him its own. It pulled at his memories, unraveling them like loose threads, showing him visions of his childhood home, his university days, the face of a colleague, all distorted, warped, and then erased. Reid screamed, a raw animal sound that seemed to be absorbed by the swirling chaos around him. This was not just an assault on his mind, it was an assault on his very being. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to grasp onto something concrete, a single undeniable truth about who he was. He fought against the torrent of forgotten lives, the relentless pull towards oblivion. He was Reid. He was here. He had a purpose. He had to remember. The ritual demanded a sacrifice of self, but he was not meant to become nothing. He was meant to become unconnectable, to exist outside its grasp, not to be consumed by it. He had to find the line between surrender and annihilation. The battle for his existence had begun. The sudden, jarring clang of metal on asphalt echoed in the crisp morning air, a sound utterly alien to the recent silence of the house. Reid flinched, his head snapping up. His surroundings were stark, unfamiliar. A concrete slab stretched before him, demarcated by yellow lines, leading to a small utilitarian booth. A barrier arm, striped in red and white, lay across the lane, its purpose clear, its presence absolute. This was the border checkpoint. He gripped the steering wheel, the plastic cool and smooth beneath his fingertips. They felt normal, or as normal as anything could feel now. The gnarled, papery skin he had seen moments ago was gone, replaced by his own familiar, if slightly trembling, flesh. A wave of profound relief, cold and sharp, washed over him, then receded, leaving behind a perplexing emptiness. Had it truly worked? Had the final, desperate act, the confrontation in the echoing stairwell, truly severed the parasitic connection? The house was behind him now, miles away, lost in the early morning mist that still clung to the valley. He pictured it, silent, perhaps too silent. The memory brought a strange satisfaction, a sense of quiet triumph. He had faced it, had pushed back against the insidious erosion, had reclaimed something. The official's face, though now discernible, remained unreadable, a placid mask of bureaucratic indifference. He approached the driver's side window, a clipboard tucked under his arm. Reid lowered the window, the faint hiss of the electric motor sounding impossibly loud in the almost perfect quiet. The air that rushed in was cool, carrying the faint scent of diesel exhaust and damp earth. He inhaled deeply, tasting freedom, or what he perceived as freedom. "Passport, please," the official stated, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. Reid fumbled in the console, his fingers brushing against forgotten coins, a crumpled map. He found his passport, its cover worn, its pages filled with stamps from long-forgotten trips. He handed it over. The official took it, his gaze sweeping over Reid's face, then down to the photo. Reid met his eyes, determined to project normalcy, coherence. He had won. He had survived. "Purpose of visit?" the official asked, flipping through the passport's pages. "Returning home," Reid replied, the words feeling foreign on his tongue, yet undeniably true. He was returning. From what? He wasn't entirely sure anyone would understand. The official paused, his thumb tracing the edge of a visa stamp. "And your previous residence?" Reid hesitated. The house. It was a memory now, a receding nightmare. "An ancestral property," he stated, keeping his voice steady. Disinterest crossed the official's face before it settled back into its neutral expression. He handed the passport back, the gesture almost dismissive. "All in order. You may proceed." The barrier arm began to rise with a low, mechanical whine. Reid nodded, a small, tight smile on his lips. He started the engine, the vehicle rumbling to life. He was free. The triumph he had felt moments ago began to curdle, replaced by a subtle, creeping unease. The absence of the entity felt less like victory and more like completion. He drove forward, passing beneath the now fully raised barrier arm, the concrete giving way to a paved road that wound through a desolate, sparsely wooded landscape. The world outside his car seemed muted, colors slightly faded, sounds distant. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. He was alone, truly alone. The house was silent. He had driven out the entity, yes, but in doing so, had he merely created a vacuum? And what exactly had filled it? The entity fed on memory, on identity, on the very perception of reality. If he had driven it out, how had he done so? By giving it nothing left to take? By becoming nothing? He glanced at his hands again, then quickly away. They were his. They had to be. But the slight tremor he saw was not from fear, not anymore. It was from an unfamiliar quietude, a stillness that had taken root deep within him, a perfect, unassailable calm. The kind of calm that came after everything had been consumed. Reid drove on, the road stretching endlessly before him, indistinguishable from the road behind. He too was silent. He felt no hunger, no thirst, no weariness. He felt only the quiet, the vast, echoing space where Reid used to be. The entity was gone. But Reid was also gone, leaving behind only an echo, a vacant husk moving through a world stripped of its vibrancy, its meaning, its very essence. The victory was complete, and the defeat absolute.